Well, thank you for having me here today. I should say, actually, this is not really my main research topic. I am an archaeologist of the Near East, and my main interest really is about the past history and its significance to the wider world. So I'm writing a book currently on empires from this region and how they actually influence the region. And in some sense, I find it quite ironic that I'm talking about this particular topic because it really deals with some of the topics we just talked about, which is the region essentially beginning to disintegrate, fall apart, and lead to things like mass-scale looting, destruction of ethnic groups, the very wanton kinds of killings we're seeing as well. And so I'm actually interested in how the region, in the very distant past, became actually quite unified. In fact, I think few people know this, but the term multiculturalism first began in the ancient Near East. This is a term that was invented in the ancient Near East. The homeland of multicultural societies begins in the past in those regions. And it's so, in a kind of twisted irony, I suppose, we're seeing that sort of multiculturalism being destroyed in front of our eyes, essentially. So what we're going to do today is talk about some of these repercussions, that is looting, that deals with this kind of disintegration. And so hopefully you'll see both the political kinds of repercussions that are happening, but I think, touching on some of the points that were brought up in the previous talk, what we can do. I don't think this is a situation where we can just simply hold our hands and sort of hope for the best. There are very direct things I think we can do to influence the situation somewhat. So we'll talk about that as well. So hopefully I'll press this correctly. So let's talk about some of the key events, just as a quick background before we get into the main sort of parts of the discussions. So obviously since the fall of Mosul, which has kind of been seen as a kind of hallmark moment, if you will, for Daesh or ISIS, we've been seeing all these headlines, in particular about the kind of looting events, the kind of this destruction that's happening in the region. In other words, we're seeing this kind of headline banner or sort of headline grabbing kind of information coming out almost on a weekly basis for a while. Maybe it's diminished more recently. But certainly, as we just mentioned, many parties are involved in this kind of looting. It was certainly happening in Syria long before ISIS even really showed up as a major party or group, so to speak. It started almost immediately after the war began, and this is probably not surprising. Looting always, in almost any region in the world, follows essentially the breakdown of government, state authority. I mean, it's comparable to the West as well. For instance, when you have, say, a major hurricane, I'm from the United States, so we have hurricanes. You get a major hurricane, in, say, what happened in Louisiana a number of years ago, about a decade ago, you had looting happen right after that. And of course, that's because you had a breakdown of a temporary authority in the region. And so New Orleans was heavily looted in places. And this is basically a larger version of that, essentially. What's different, of course, is now we have this ISIS group, this Daesh group, which is basically organizing some of the looting. And it's still only one of the players among other players. And part of the problem, I think, is that we're getting a slightly skewed understanding of what's happening because the media, I think, focuses a little too much on just simply ISIS. We are actually having a very twisted kind of conflict. We don't really have any good players in this conflict. There are no good sides, and I kind of wish we would see more that sort of portrayed in the press, that basically everyone is doing a bad job in terms of what's happening in protecting Syria's cultural heritage and also leading to the destruction of its various cultural groups. Yes, it's clear looting has accelerated in places since 2014, but really it's a question of exactly who's buying these antiquities as well as the kinds of groups involved. We'll talk about that in a moment. So one of the things we should also discuss is we should separate the idea of destruction of cultural property from the actual looting of objects. One is intended to give a message to us, perhaps a message to the supporters, and we'll probably maybe hear about this more a little later on. But the destruction of things like the famous monasteries, so we have Mar Elian Monastery that was destroyed not too long ago, the Mosul Museum, the ransacking of the museum, Nimrud, of course, we just saw, Palmyra, of course, the various sites within Palmyra, Nebi Yunus, perhaps one of the first sort of high-profile destructions that happened in 2014, as well as examples. And in all these cases, it was a message of ISIS that they wanted to give, that they're essentially doing their religious duty, that they're essentially destroying these kind of apostate places that belonged to different groups or perhaps even other Muslims. In fact, what's interesting we should note is that most of the sites destroyed by IS or Daesh have been Islamic sites. It's actually the minority of the sites are either the distant or ancient sites or the Christian sites. Of course, they're affecting all these groups, including the ancient past or the sort of heritage sites. But we have to remember IS is causing a tremendous amount of damage to the Islamic heritage of the region, including the Islamic groups that are within the region. So what I like to do is term this kind of high-profile destruction as kind of a ministry of propaganda, a sort of message-producing organization, if you will, of IS. They may not have a formal ministry of propaganda, but essentially that's what this is. So the destruction of the arch that we talked about, the destruction of the two temples, and in particular, have been part of that message. And so that's not really, that's really falling in line with this kind of showing that they're doing their religious duty by destroying these things, and thus we're supposed to sort of believe that they are doing the religious duty and beginning this year zero kind of sort of strategy, that is wiping out the distant past, starting anew. So we just saw a picture of Cambodia previously, for instance, and that was kind of the same mentality as the Khmer Rouge. Let's wipe out the previous culture, let's wipe out what was there before and start anew by destroying these sort of well-known symbols of the past. And I think that's what this kind of message is being given to us, is displaying. But reality is a kind of practical end of what IS does. It might be focusing on the main parts, or it did focus when it was controlling the site, on the main parts of the site where, in Palmyra specifically, where you had the arch, the two main temples. So that would have been located, I don't know if you could sort of see the mouse, perhaps, maybe not, but, or is there a pointer, right? So you would have had the main temples, the sort of main parts of the city would have been right here. But a lot of people are not looking at that. All around this city, there are many graves around Palmyra. And those graves have been looted for many decades. You could have found basically little statues, little busts coming from these graves, like this one, from Palmyra, maybe 50, 60 years ago in the antiquities market. Certainly it's happening now as well. And so this is an area that has been focused on in looting for a long time. It has certainly picked up since the outbreak of the war. So before IS showed up, this region was already being looted. And of course, what they're looking at or going after are these sort of busts. They're very portable, they're transportable, that is, they can be moved. The things that IS or Daesh is destroying were things that they cannot sell. There's no value to these things as far as they're concerned. They could only provide propaganda value in terms of a message, but they provide no monetary value. And of course, ultimately, Daesh is essentially a state, or at least acts like a state in terms of organizing itself. So they need to generate some revenue, and those revenues are generated through the sort of indirect tax collection of antiquities sales. And so that's why these areas were potentially targeted. Now, we actually haven't got a formal report of the kinds of damage that have happened in these graves. We don't know how much damage has happened, say, during the period that Daesh was controlling this area. There are certainly some damage, and one can see on imagery some looting holes, but the extent hopefully will not be that much. It's not very clear what the extent is, but we'll probably be hearing about this in the months to come. As we just talked about earlier, Afema or Apamea certainly is an example of one of these earlier patterns, and it again shows that this looting is happening by a number of groups. So this was a region, of course, that was heavily looted long before Daesh even showed up. This is, of course, what happened, what the site looked like before. There was a few little holes in various places before 2011, but obviously in 2012, things picked up quite dramatically. So again, it follows this kind of traditional pattern of looting happening when state authority begins to collapse. Perhaps there is potential collusion with this state in this case, or some of the other groups involved. That's not necessarily clear. We don't quite know how the other sort of parties involved in this conflict are actually involved, or indirectly, or perhaps directly involved in some of the looting. We don't hear so much about that, but they certainly could be. So looting seems to be going on essentially everywhere. This is a map of sites that have been documented to be looted. You can see the borders are a little bit incorrect in terms of who controls what territory, but generally, of course, the sort of opposition parties are control these regions, and down here we have looting, of course, occurring in those areas. The government areas are generally towards the west of the country, and you have various looting happening there. And certainly Daesh or IS is basically controlling these eastern regions, these Sunni areas, and then you have the Kurdish as well. The Kurdish groups are also involved or have sites within their territories that are being or have been looted. So essentially what we're seeing is a pattern that every side in this conflict has sites that have been looted at various times. And of course, the key difference is the organization. So it's not clear if the Kurdish, the FSA, and government areas are organized by the controlling parties, whereas in the IS area, of course, it definitely is clear that IS is controlling the looting in a sense that they actually have a formal ministry. They even call it a kind of Ministry of Antiquities. But typically you have Ministry of Antiquities in Near Eastern states. Usually they're in charge of sort of organizing the foreigners who come in to excavate. So when I go to work in the Near East, I usually have to deal with a Ministry of Antiquities. But of course what's different here is Daesh is basically a Ministry of Antiquities that deals with looting, essentially selling antiquities or destroying them. So that's what they do, is essentially provide these kinds of licenses to loot. And so this is an example of perhaps one of the best examples we have. This is what a license looks like. It tells you essentially it belongs to this department that's in charge, this Qism Athar, so that's basically the division of archaeology that's in charge of this looting. And so it gives you a kind of permission here. So you'd be perhaps a normal person who lives in this region who would ask for permission from IS. You would pay your fee, and then you would go ahead and start looting. So essentially what they're doing is putting an organization that allows looters to then go to the sites. They even sometimes provide things like dynamites, bulldozers, sort of the materials needed to assist the looting. And then the looters would go ahead and do their own business. A lot of these looters were probably people who were already looters before the war. But now they're sort of operating within a kind of state apparatus, if you will, that they have to kind of go through, pay the taxes, get the license, pay for the fees, those kinds of things, and these are the kind of things they're looking for. It's usually small antiquities that are very portable but also highly valuable. But usually the key sort of objective is small in size, high in value. Those are the kinds of qualities you want when you're looting, and so not surprising why we're seeing looting happening in potential grave sites. Graves tend to have fairly valuable objects. They often are generally small, and so they sort of focus on these kind of small statues in these graves. So the big question, of course, many of us have is, what is the scale of looting? What is the sort of level of impact, the kinds of theft that's happening, and how much is actually happening? The short answer is we don't actually really know. We don't know how extensive in terms of sales. The State Department, the US State Department, after doing its raid in Abu Sayyaf, the compound in Syria last year, about a year ago, in fact, they sort of put out some estimates on their website looking into roughly, using the documents that they seized, roughly how much sales IS or Daesh is making from these things. And they said something on the order of millions, tens of millions, perhaps at most 10 million, something like that, could be something feasible from this. And I think that is a potentially useful number in terms of giving an idea. It doesn't sound like much, but I don't think this is a war where a lot of money necessarily is going into it. Most of the conflict we're seeing is that it's actually not supported by large sums of cash. Most of the problems are occurring with actually fairly low sums of cash, low kinds of essentially weaponry that causes a lot of chaos. I mean, we think of examples like terrorist activities. They don't really cost that much money. And so this kind of level of money, funding, essentially, is not necessary to have tens or even hundreds of millions. So it's a good kind of a way to say it is IS or Daesh is essentially is a rich organization, but a very poor state. But by being a rich organization, they can certainly organize a lot of activity that's quite nefarious. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. But there are other potential proxies we can use. So the US State Department has also put out slightly old data now, but you can see sort of estimates by the US Trade Commission of how much in terms of sales of art, looted art or smuggled art, if you will, coming from different countries. So if we look at Syria and Iraq, we could see sort of, at least by 2013, a sort of upswing, and particularly from Syria, you go from roughly 4 million to 11 million. I don't quite understand how they derive these estimates, so don't ask me too much about that. But at least according to some sources within the State Department, they do seem to suggest that there is more activity of looted, let's just say, art, which antiquities would potentially fall under, coming from these areas. And again, that could be not only IS or Daesh, let's say, but it could also come from looted art coming from the government as well as the FSA area. So again, it covers probably a more comprehensive understanding of Syria rather than just simply IS, which tends to get more of the headlines. Another kind of cursory example, this is from Neil Brody's website. He sort of runs a blog where he tracks some of these things and discusses some of these issues. And I picked this kind of small example. This is a small scale example meant to sort of illustrate sort of what's happening. So just between November 2015 and February 2016, a very, what I would consider, what's generally considered, at least by the sort of trade, a relatively low value item. This is a Neolithic statue, essentially, a kind of little figurine, which is very specific to areas of Syria and Iraq. It dates from periods, it's called the Halaf, which is a Neolithic period that tends to be diagnostic for this feature. So I tend to look at objects that are very early when I'm looking for looting, because earlier sites or earlier periods tend to be very localized kinds of cultures or very localized kinds of patterns. And so we can tell this is going to come from, say, roughly Syria, Iraq, sometimes Turkey as well, but mostly from these regions. And so just looking at it over a short period of time, you can see 60 figurines, for instance, would sell for something on the order of a little over 6,000 pounds. Again, we're not dealing with high numbers, but we start to add these sort of low volume, low sort of you would say lower value kinds of items being sold over time, you do begin to accumulate a lot of money. And so one of the problems we're finding is that there's a lot of focus on the relatively high value items, items that are, say, worth 50,000, 100,000 pounds, things like mosaics, for instance, or capitals, or other kinds of things that potentially have relatively high value. Now, it's good to focus on those things, but I think we need to also focus on these lower value kinds of items, because of course you get large volumes of them being sold, you start accumulating a fairly large amount of cash. And so one of the things that we haven't really looked at least in terms of some of the things I'll mention later on, is really focusing on these low volumes kinds of objects. And as I mentioned, things that tend to be looted tend to be objects that are small and provide sort of easy ways of transports, and of course are not noticeable when you get to things like the border control in different countries. This is the kind of thing that you can easily sneak in to the UK, and it's almost impossible for anyone to know what it is even by the time it gets here. So this is the kind of thing that we should be actually paying attention to, because it has potential influence on the conflict through the funds raised. Now, trying to understand the thefts that are going on, the kind of looting going on, is a very difficult endeavor. There isn't really any good systematic study, in my opinion. So the best piece that I can find, in my opinion, was actually a reporter piece done by a guy named Mike Giglio, who actually was literally embedded with looters in southern Turkey, as sort of the looting organizations, I should say, that were operating in southern Turkey. So southern Turkey is kind of one of the chief hotbeds, or at least was, of where a lot of the looted materials would be going into. Not surprisingly, the borders in southern Turkey were very open, which is why a lot of extremists go through essentially southern Turkey. And so that also includes things like antiquities, other things being smuggled were going through the border fairly easily. And so by doing a kind of investigatory piece, he sort of spent some time with some of the looters operating these smuggling rings, and got to know what they were sort of sending across. So he sent me various pictures, for instance. He talked to other archaeologists interested in this region, started gathering information. We can certainly tell that a lot of these objects certainly are real in many cases. So there's a good number of fairly real-looking glass, coins, those kinds of things. But there's also a lot of fakes coming out. Things like mosaics, for instance. Some of them are real, but a lot of them are fake. Other kinds of things like inscriptions, jewelry. I've seen a number of fakes there as well. It's not surprising. We talked about how tourism was a major part of the Syrian economy prior to the war, and that means there were a lot of artisans in Syria who made objects that were similar to antiquities for the tourists. And of course, these artisans have to survive. And it comes down to this quote, I think. We've been living in a war for more than 4 years. Well, now it's more than 5 years. And so people certainly have to feed their children. And that ultimately wraps up, I think, why this is happening. What I also find quite interesting about this piece is that it highlights another type of looting. There are several ways in which sites are being looted. One is a kind of bulldozer dynamite way of looting a site. That is, you literally go to a site, blow it up, or just sort of knock off a big chunk of it, and you try to extract whatever you can of value fairly quickly and easily. So you see a bunch of seals, perhaps coins often appear quite easily, and those things get looted fairly substantially. Another way is this, and I kind of wish we can run this video, but it's kind of difficult. But these are basically people excavating this site, and if you look, just looking at it, it looks like almost like a proper excavation. They're even excavating within these bulks. These are kind of ways to one can control an excavation. They're digging carefully. You can see them using a brush here, for instance. So what they're looking for is very high value kinds of things. This is the site of Dura Europos we just talked about. Dura Europos, of course, is known for very famous mosaics, or not mosaics, but excuse me, but frescoes painted on walls that came from this site. Some of the earliest churches, for instance, many temples. This is a city that had over 50 temples, had about 8 languages. So when I talked about the Near East as being really the heartland, if you will, or even the cradle of multiculturalism, in my opinion, Dura Europos was one of the best sites to see that. There was a church, there was a synagogue, and there was something like 50 temples to various gods. Gods covering India, to gods covering the Roman gods, to covering other regions. So essentially you had gods from almost everywhere in the entire old world represented in this one small town. So what they were looking for are these mosaics from some of these places, these frescoes, which then could have potentially high value. So they're digging very carefully. So it shows you that some of this looting also is very professional. It's some of these previous excavators of these sites, or people who would have worked these sites, and digging very carefully to find these high value kinds of goods. So we have these 2 levels of looting, one careful and one, let's say, not so careful and quick and dirty kind of job. So then what happens to the items once they get looted? Where do they go? Who's buying them specifically? Well, as I mentioned, these border states are the critical place to look. And so that's why Mike actually sort of spends some time in Turkey. And then certainly Turkey has probably been one of the chief hubs. Lebanon traditionally has been as well. The Lebanese are sort of well known for their business acumen, their connections around the world. So Lebanon, certainly Beirut was a major hub for antiquities for a long time, and still is to some extent. Jordan, probably not as much. The borders in Jordan are slightly more tight than they are in the north. So the level of antiquities going into Jordan is certainly slightly more restrained, I would say. And in fact, I had my own experience of this back in 2003, that the Jordanians do actually spend some effort in policing for antiquities. I got stopped. I was in Iraq, in Baghdad, right after the fall of the regime. And on my way out, I was stopped by the police, and they thought I was looting antiquities because I had some coins from the Ba'ath era, 1960s coins on me. So I was quite upset that these were not antiquities, in my opinion. But at least they were doing their job, so to speak, in that they were checking carefully what kind of objects were coming. So the Jordanians are historically slightly better at policing their borders, I would say, than some of the other surrounding states. So once things go to these border states, what often happens is, of course, is the next sort of set of states. If you look at this map, actually, it's almost like flowing the same kind of routes that perhaps the refugees are taking. That's probably not surprising. I would say some of these smugglers involved in refugees are probably the same smugglers involved in bringing antiquities. I would not be surprised. So they're going to go to the next set of states, so Bulgaria, Romania. There's been a few pieces in the press of objects turning up there. There was a seizure that happened a few months ago of some objects coming from Iraq. They were certainly Iraqi based on the look of the objects, so that suggests they're coming from looted sites in Iraq. And so after that, they most likely then go to the West, the sort of the Western European markets. Germany, Britain, Sweden have been some of the key ones, France to some extent as well, perhaps. We don't know this flow to be exact. This is all somewhat conjectural in the sense that it's following historical patterns, but there are some known examples in these places where things have turned up. So what's also different about this is that the way looting is happening now is quite different from how it happened even just a decade ago. During this last decade, we've seen the rise of social media exponentially growing. This has actually made moving things much easier. It's made the sale of antiquities much easier. You can now basically be on the borders of Syria and Turkey using WhatsApp. You message your buddy in Germany saying, hey, I have this mosaic. How much would you like for it? I have a client. On the other side, the person would say, I have a client set up. He's willing to pay for it. Here's the deal. Now, this kind of sort of a small example is actually what happened in one case from Turkey, where Mike was able to show that these sort of sales would happen through things like WhatsApp, where they would take pictures, send these sort of images and text information about the objects discovered, and then send it to someone on sort of the Western markets. And of course, the Western markets aren't the only one. Some of this probably flows to places like the Gulf. So the museums there certainly potentially are one source, perhaps private collectors. Also East Asia. Japan in the past has been a market, as well as other East Asian countries, and as well as Australia. So certainly there are multiple places where these things can be flowing to. Germany, as I mentioned, is one example of some places where it has been turned up. In fact, Germany has been very good about this lately. They have tightened up their antiquities laws substantially over the last year and a half, I would say, where they've now made it much harder to sell these antiquities in general. So there's been a lot of lobbying efforts by archaeologists there. And so some of the things have been tightening up in that particular country. But to be honest, among all the various markets, relatively few really beat London. I mean, in all honesty, it's a bit of an elephant in the room. So we can see, of course, major auctioning houses, but we also have many small auctioning or operations. Some follow set organizations like ADA, which do a relatively good job in monitoring and also preventing the sales of illegal antiquities, but some do not. And one of the problems that we're seeing is that, I think this is partly where we can begin to be more effective in doing something in the Western markets. It's still relatively easy to sell antiquities here without much regulation, in the sense that you can sell things and not necessarily have much detail about its provenance, its life history. So for instance, there are far stricter laws about selling televisions or eggs even in Europe that prevent, or that basically mean that the consumer has a right to know where those eggs or televisions come from, right? So when you have a barcode, there's some kind of legislation that tells us that ultimately, if I had to find out where that egg or television came from, I can do that. We don't have that for antiquities. There's nothing like that. So when something is sold to you, oftentimes you basically have to believe the word of the seller. So one of the problems we're having is that you can spot an object that comes from the Near East, but how do you know, or do you know when that object actually arrived? That we don't know almost anything about in many cases. Short of basically the antiquity dealer telling you this object was obtained from Syria a year ago, which almost never happens because that's basically incriminating the seller, then you have relatively or often very little evidence. Sir, there are policing efforts. There's an arts and antiquities unit within Metropolitan Police, which has 3 or 3.5 positions, I guess. So they are doing a very good job. I work with them. I collaborate with them, I should say, at times. So they are very good at proactive and sort of creating networks of experts to talk to, and they've talked to me and others a number of times about these things. So they certainly are very active, but it's definitely not enough. And there's a lot of this world that we don't know about. So it's one of these things I think we need to sort of work with the trade, the legal trade, to sort of know more about who's involved, potentially involved in this, and try to get to sort of understanding how illegal antiquities are brought into this country. That's something we still don't quite understand. We hear a lot from people in the trade saying that it's not coming into the market, it's barely there. And there's maybe some truth to that. It's not coming in huge droves. Historically, we know what generally happens is that when objects get looted from a country, they don't often get sold right away in a Western market or in a market. They usually wait a while. They put them in storage for some time. They maybe wait 5 to 10 years, and then they begin to flood the market. This is actually what happened slightly in terms of the 2003 Iraq War. Some of the things that were looted in 2003 did not appear in the market until about 5 or 6 years later, they began to appear. So there's kind of a wait period, particularly if a story or news is very interested in the topic. So in this case, we have a lot of press interest in objects coming from Syria and Iraq. And so the likelihood is that we're not going to hear very much, we're not going to see very much objects being sold openly from these regions because, of course, it would almost be very stupid for a dealer to do that. So that's what we think is happening. There may be a period of time where these objects will sort of wait in storage, if you will, and then begin to appear on the market more openly, perhaps, or perhaps just go simply directly to buyers who are already pre-established using social media, as I talked about in the earlier example that I gave. So as I mentioned, some of these kinds of things that are used by some of these deals, WhatsApp, Facebook, eBay, you find lots of things from the Near East on eBay. Again, all the problems with particularly eBay is that you don't know when these objects came. There aren't rules about displaying what's the life history of these objects. So I can go on eBay and say that's a Near Eastern object, that's a Phoenician-looking glass, for instance, or a seal that comes from Syria, most likely, from this period. I can identify that as an expert, but I cannot tell when this object arrived to a certain location and when it was obtained. And so these kinds of lack of forcing the dealers, the sellers, to disclose this information, I think creates problems in that we don't actually know enough about the life history of these objects. And I think that's where one of the key loopholes, if you will, one of the key holes that we have in current legislation is that there just isn't enough requirements for all objects to be clearly disclosed to us in terms of their life history, their provenance, and when they came. And in cases where there is information, oftentimes it's information that doesn't seem very well of high quality. So it looks like a piece of paper that someone literally just signed their name. You don't know who they are. There's no authority regulating it, and a simple stamp or that kind of thing. So it's something that's done in an ad hoc fashion, perhaps to give a buyer a kind of assurance. But to be honest, most of these things don't have very clear information, almost all objects you buy. So many sites looted are, if we're looking at also the pattern of looting, one of the things that we do notice is that many sites looted tend to be Hellenistic and later in date. That's not surprising, perhaps. There's a large desire, if you will, for in the market for classical and later kinds of period objects. The problem is that many of these sites, from an archaeological point of view, are more difficult to provenance. Such objects are fairly ubiquitous no matter where you go. So, for instance, you find a statue of Hercules. You can find that in Britain or in Syria. It could almost be the same exact statue in the classical periods. So it's hard to really pinpoint the location. So one of the things that we've been doing is focusing more on these earlier periods, Iron Age, Bronze Age periods, where one has much more localized kind of artistic patterns one can use to localize objects to find where they potentially come from. So again, the burden of proof of looted items is not on the antiquity seller, it's often on us, people who want to know if there are objects that are being looted, and that makes it a bit of a problem as well. So cylinder seals are one thing that I look for because these objects are the exact kind of characteristics that I talked about. Small, portable, oftentimes can be of high value. You can buy a seal for something 5,000 to 6,000 pounds in places sometimes much higher. Some seals are worth far less. They vary in value. Tablets, cuneiform tablets. This is a kind of writing system, Akkadian, which was invented 5,000 years ago. Writing begins in this region. So this is the kind of writing style that was invented. So tablets are, of course, of high value. Sometimes they're mundane kinds of tablets that talk about economic transactions. Sometimes they're very valuable. They tell you stories that have parallels to sort of biblical stories, perhaps, or even other kinds of stories. And so they can be quite valuable. Proof of when they were taken, once again, is usually the hard part, proving whether in this country for 100 years, 10 years, 5 years, we don't know. Now, in terms of specific cases where we know some objects have been coming in from Syria and Iraq, I can talk about a couple where I've been involved with. So one was a case where I was involved with a local sort of port authority that seized a container item full of mostly, I would say, antiques, not antiquities. They were objects that were probably dated last few hundred years, gold, jewelry, necklaces, that sort of thing. But within that container, there were a couple of objects that were quite old, in my opinion. One of these was a bracelet, probably dates to about 500 BC, something like that. As you can see, a bronze sort of bronze copper kinds of bracelet. And then you have to the right this sort of base. I'm not quite sure what it is, to be honest, but this sort of base that was found, which may be Iron Age or later. So in these cases, it looked like antiquities. The Port Authority informed me that it came from Syria, which should have been, I guess, a red flag. And they stopped this container, and they sent these pictures to me. And I said, yes, please do seize these objects, because they look like they're ancient, basically. But in this case, what do you think actually happened? Well, it was released. Lack of evidence cited as the main reason, which I'm not quite sure what the lack of evidence was. So these items were eventually let go to the person. And by the way, the person who was importing these objects was a known antiquities dealer, even though a lot of the items were actually antiques, not antiquities. Nonetheless, they were going to this person due to a lack of evidence. So one thing that opened my eyes, I think, in this case, is that customs in this country doesn't actually work exactly the way the customs that I was used to. Customs in the United States had a much more policing authority. And I know there are laws in this country where customs can essentially act with some policing powers. But generally, customs is treated as part of a revenue service. And so, therefore, there is pressure, it seems, from what I can gather from talking to various individuals, on releasing items without very substantial evidence, essentially. So there's nothing like ICE. ICE is an organization, for instance, in the United States that is a kind of policing authority within customs. They have the power to seize, and they often are very active in seizing objects. So in the United States, for instance, I'll give you an example. In 2003, after the war there were also cases where customs did call me about objects that they had stopped. And they were very active in seizing objects and taking them away from sellers. And so we know that, at least in the United States example, they were very active in taking objects. So one thing we've seen is that perhaps there needs to be some updates there in terms of the laws and the kinds of policing powers customs at least applies. Maybe in practical sense that there isn't enough police push going on in terms of the custom activities. I'm not sure. But this is something that has kind of opened up my eyes. Maybe we could discuss it later on. Another case, which was, I think, featured in this Channel 4 documentary that came out a few weeks ago, is this lintel. This is a lintel that was in a shop in New Bond Street area, which was mentioned by the owner. The reason why we knew this was from Syria happened to be because the owner said it. So remember I mentioned that the sellers do not have the burden to really provide that much proof to us. So you have to basically wait for them to slip before we can move. And so in this case, the owner actually mentioned, oh yeah, this piece is from Nawa, Syria. Nawa, Syria, of course, is in a region that's now currently under conflict. It's under current FSA/Nusra occupation, but it's within the borders of also, or near IS area. It's also near the government area, so it's one of these conflict kind of places. This derives from a Byzantine house, it seems. It's a lintel, so it would have been a decorative piece along the top of a wall. And this is one of the publication pictures from the 1930s. I should probably point to it so you know what I'm talking about. This piece right here is from the 1930s. This is the picture of the item in the shop. So this is basically taken, I think, in November last year. So it's the same object. You can see it's been broken. There's another picture from the 1980s of this object, which was found, I think, as well through an Interpol site. And it shows you that, of course, one, this item is published. Two, the image of the 1980s that shows the same object proves that the object must have been looted. By the 1980s, Syria had very stringent antiquities laws. You cannot remove known monuments. You cannot remove archaeological sites and export them. There are very strict laws in most of these countries. So Syria certainly protected its antiquities, at least in terms of the laws, prior to the conflict. And so this certainly would have been an illegal removal if this item was sold. And it seems to be in the case, since it was present in Syria in the 1980s, it must have been removed illegally. So that's another sort of example of an item that's been looted and brought here. Once again, we still don't know exactly when it came. It could have been pre-2011. Probably was pre-2011, in my opinion. But this is, again, showing you the problem. We don't have enough information of pinpointing the dates. And we only knew about this because the shopkeeper essentially slipped. We wouldn't have known about it otherwise. But it gives us an example of the kinds of demand that potentially exists in markets like London. So the reality is we don't know enough about looting coming into Western markets. We know some through sort of examples that I gave you, such as the Port Authority one, as well as this lintel from New Bond Street area. But it is arriving in the West, is the point. It's observed now and documented to some extent. I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think we're going to see more in the years to come, because knowing the pattern of looting in the past, we know these objects tend to hit the market more so when news and the media have died away. So more likely we're going to see more objects in about a few years' time frame, let's say. We don't know the scale is another issue. We don't know how extensive things are being brought into the country currently. We're likely just getting a small part of the story. So in the end, it's not hard to sell antiquities. You can see it's very easy to bring small objects, small sort of figurines, sell them perhaps for low prices. These larger objects even are getting through, like the lintel, for instance. Clearly that could have been stopped if people were aware what it should be or what it was. So you have to get greedy, basically, or do something really stupid, similar to perhaps what the shopkeeper did, maybe unknowingly, or simply making an honest mistake. I mean, I think actually in this case of the shopkeeper, I don't think he necessarily knew the item was looted. So it's possible that people are making honest mistakes in selling these things. By the time these things move through many hands, from point of origin in Syria to the seller, it's not necessarily clear to the seller, the one who's selling it, the object, to someone buying it, that this object necessarily was looted. It may have been obtained, as far as they know, in a legal way. So once again, we don't have the documentation, life history of objects, so it's impossible to really know what's happening to these objects. So I want to talk about some positive things that are happening. So we talked about the memories of 2003, perhaps being still somewhat fresh, I think fairly fresh in our minds. And I think that experience, the lack of planning, I should say there was planning, certainly on the American side. I was involved in some of the planning in 2003, working with some of the State Department's Future of Iraq projects, where we did actually meet and give very detailed plans of what should be protected. And number one was the museum. But of course, as history now says, no one listened to us in terms of the planning. But there were some steps taken, I should say, before 2003. Now, that experience in 2003, I think, though, has led to, particularly Britain and the United States, to be more proactive, I think, in terms of what's happening now. There are steps, as we mentioned, measures being taken to sort of at least try to do something with looting, and particularly the link between looting and fundamentalism, the terror that we're seeing, is also gotten the interest of not just, say, cultural experts, but also, of course, policing and FBI and other kinds of organizations that are interested in more sort of terrorist activities occurring in different places, CIA and all that. So there are more interests certainly happening. In Britain, we see, of course, recent initiatives. We just talked about the British Museum receiving some of this cultural fund, and there's going to be more money released coming up soon as part of that 30 million cultural fund. So we'll see hopefully an active bidding process, and we'll see what kind of projects that are funded. So once again, the focus will probably be on Near East, and probably related to protection, replication, and perhaps even some legislation efforts to try to tighten up some of the antiquities law. And related to what we just heard from this Queen's speech just yesterday, the all-party parliamentary group, which was put together back last year. This is a picture taken from that initial launch event with Boris as well as David Burrows. This is Walk of Truth. This is Tasula Hajatofi, who represents one of these organizations involved. So this all-parliamentary group was put together in part to sort of look into the trade and perhaps create some suggestions. And one of those suggestions were to sort of adopt this Hague Convention. And it's nice to see that lobbying efforts come to some fruition by the all-parliamentary party group. So there were some benefits or some positive outcomes coming out of that. So in the UK, of course, discussion now on getting the Hague Convention protocols put into law is towards the top of the discussion. There are, I think, more practical things too. For instance, tightening up some of these regulations of how you sell antiquities. So for instance, the kind of paperwork that's required, the licensing, perhaps the burden of proof should be on the sellers. I think, in my opinion, that's one thing I'd like to see, is that we put more pressure on sellers to show evidence that they're not selling looted antiquities, rather than someone like me having to prove that they are not selling a looted antiquity. So that the burden of proof, I think, in my opinion, should be on the sellers. And if we change that law, then that would be a much more substantial benefit, in my opinion. So we're seeing some new changes in laws in Germany, for instance, tightening of the laws regarding provenance. So Germany certainly is beginning to address this issue of provenance. So I think we need to begin to do that as well. So this quote this came from a newspaper. That's why I got this sort of egg example. It's easier to provenance an egg than antiquities currently. And so we need to change that, I think, that dynamic. So legislative acts, of course, are good. They should force dealers to provide convincing evidence of where provenance, or even having the licenses of selling these things, should be done. But the reality is, let's face it, even if all these laws got passed, including the Hague Convention, is that it's still going to be hard to enforce these things. Criminals will always be criminals, and people will always do bad things, I suppose, or stuff will always happen. But the point is that we still need to sort of do something else, I think, more than just creating laws. Laws take a long time to create, they take a long time to implement, they're often poorly implemented in cases. So there are other things I think we can do. So I think social stigma, something as simple as that, is actually quite effective. And perhaps the best example I can think of is the blood diamonds stigma that was created a little over a decade, or more than a decade ago now. So in this case, it did dent some of the trade, not completely successfully, but some of the trade certainly was dented. This idea that people selling diamonds had to make clear where they're getting their diamonds from. I think this is something we can do for antiquities. We should make it clear that people who are selling antiquities should make it clear where they're getting their objects from, when they got their objects as well is very important, and how they got their objects. So a kind of stigma effect, if you will, a campaign, if you will, I think could be potentially more useful. Certificates, perhaps, so you have, for instance, companies now that sell diamonds use certifications that indicate that they obtained diamonds that were not obtained from conflict regions. So I don't see why we can't do something similar for antiquities, a kind of certification process that has a proper authority over it, so it's certified, truly certified, that these antiquities were not obtained from a conflict region. So perhaps this, if the Hague Convention gets passed, that's something that could be a way to implement the Hague, is by having some authority to sort of implement that there are certificates that certify objects are not coming from conflict regions. As we saw this sort of arch, whatever you think of it, in Trafalgar Square in terms of the Palmyra Arch. Again, I think it's useful because I think it brings attention to the issue of Syria, its antiquities, as well as Iraq, and how it all relates to current events. We talked about the refugee crisis, and I think this ties in with the refugee crisis. Funding of activities that relate to violence that are coming through antiquities will, of course, lead to things like refugees. And so we do have to tackle this problem because it does affect what's happening in Europe, and certainly discussion about leaving the EU and those kinds of things are actually indirectly or directly related. Antiquities monitoring. So there's a lot of I would say, bottom-up efforts. One organization, in particular, Walk of Truth, is very much involved in this, where they're trying to create a globalized network of common people, basically normal people who are aware of antiquities being sold in given places. They provide tips, almost like a hotline you would with police. So for instance, think of crime watchers. So they even call it a kind of cultural crime watchers. So in a kind of crime watchers program, if you receive a tip, you can send that tip then to the police. The police can have a chance to react. A case is created, and then they begin to investigate particular things. So these kinds of things, I think, are initiatives, if you will, are very good because it empowers people. It brings in communities, including some of the people from the region, so Syria and Iraq, where the refugees are coming. There are probably, as I mentioned, some of the smugglers for people are probably the same smugglers for antiquities. Perhaps some of the refugees may actually be knowledgeable about antiquities being sort of smuggled through these routes, so that perhaps bringing them into the conversation might actually be quite useful to this in terms of putting them in a position where they can begin to divulge more information about antiquities they may have spotted. Those kinds of examples, I think, are potentially proactive and useful kinds of results that can come out of what's happening. So I'm sure there are more things that one can do, but I think this is the beginning. I'm very happy to see that at least it was sort of mentioned, the Hague Convention in the Queen's speech yesterday. There was effort behind the scenes, certainly to lobby for that, so that's good to see that. But there's, I think, things we can do as well in terms of sort of creating this social stigma, as well as perhaps being involved in some of these antiquities monitoring kinds of services like Walk of Truth, can help us begin to take a more proactive effort in combating the looting of antiquities, and perhaps also do an effort to really stop groups like IS and others involved in this kind of activity. So thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll have a nice discussion.